Welcome to another meeting of Susquehanna Group of Sierra Club. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Valdi Biederpass. I'm a volunteer serving as the chair of the Susquehanna Group of Sierra Club. And tonight we have Dr. Amy Churchill from Binghamton University, who will be giving us a presentation on ecosystem services of northern wetlands. These meetings are free and open to the public. You don't have to be a member of Sierra Club to attend, but we encourage membership as it helps us by providing funding for our activities and lets us know your contact information so we can keep you updated on what's happening. So I wanted to give a few announcements before we get into the presentations. I'm also going to be giving a short talk on recent changes in legislation and regulations regarding wetlands. But before that, I want to mention that, again, New York State is more than 3 years behind on meeting its 2030 climate goals according to its climate law. And just earlier this week, I did some research and I found the New York ISO put out a trend report that ends with data for 2023. And this graph shows the mix of where our electricity in New York State comes from. The brown is coal, that faded away back in 2016. The red is dual fuel, which is like a power plant that can run off of oil or natural gas, that type of thing. Then we've got natural gas. And then nuclear is the bright green. And then up at the top is renewable, that's mostly hydropower. We're lucky we have the big dams on the St. Lawrence River. That is where most of our hydropower, and actually that ends up being most of our renewable electricity right now is where that comes from. And then the little sliver at the top that's green is wind, and then even smaller sliver than that is solar, which is hardly even visible here. So what I did earlier this week was I pasted together, just did some quick graphical analysis. I pasted together 3 sheets to project out the trend line. If we stay on the same trend line for renewable energy, we're not going to get to 70% renewable electricity until 2100, the end of this century. So it's pathetically slow. And the state is not acknowledging this. They're not talking about it. They're not even talking about the 2030 goals anymore, this is supposed to be met in 2030. Here's 2030. We have to go on this steep line, grow this renewable energy this fast in the remaining 5 years to 2030. That's 15 times as fast as the actual trend line. 15. That's crazy. Nobody's talking about this. So I just wanted to bring this to your attention that that's how much of a problem we have in terms of the big picture. I have been bringing this up. Other people have been bringing this up for years in the activist community. And recently, the Sierra Club, as well as, let me see here. This email just came out today. Earth Justice is going to do a big favor for people. They are going to file a lawsuit to try to get the state to hold firm on meeting its own climate law that was passed 5 years ago in 2019. So what I'm asking tonight is if anybody here or anybody at home in the audience is willing to put their name forward as a volunteer to serve as a person that's harmed, legally speaking, from pollution from fossil fuels. This is especially true if you live in an urban area or close to a fossil fuel power plant, or maybe an area that has a lot of traffic from vehicles, cars, trucks, whatever, airport, power plant. If you can respond to Roger Downs at Sierra Club or Hillary Adun at Earth Justice, I can give people the emails. It's roger.downs@sierraclub.org. And the other one is HAIDUN at earthjustice.org. And And especially if you've got some chronic health conditions, including asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, diabetes, heart disease, or lung cancer, and also if you're an older adult, older than 65, let's say, which I am, but I don't really live in an urban area. Otherwise, I would put my name forward on this, and I'm not really close to a power plant either. And traffic is not really that big of a deal where I live. I live in a suburb, so I don't really fit what they're looking for. But if somebody is willing to put their name forward and be somebody that's represented in this lawsuit against New York State, then that would be helpful. So, all right, that's what I wanted to say about that. Because we need to push the state to do what, live up to their claim that they're a climate leader. They're really not doing what they're supposed to be doing. It's way too slow. Also, if you can contact your elected officials, especially the governor's office, and urge Kathy Hochul to live up to the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, New York State's climate law, that would be super helpful too. Also, while you're on the phone, say you don't want nuclear power because that's too toxic, too expensive, too slow, and too risky to serve as a climate solution. If you started to build a power plant today for a nuclear power plant, it likely wouldn't be finished for 15 years if you're lucky. And the small modular reactors, they really haven't even been proven in the United States yet. The regulatory officials are not even totally understanding those because there's so many different varieties of them. So that's a big risk too. And you really can't trust the nuclear power industry based on their history. Next month, we're trying to firm this up, but we believe we have Dr. Don Hughes will be giving us a presentation on how PFAS, it's one of the forever chemicals. It's a class of chemicals that are used for making water repellency. They serve in, they used to be in surfactants for firefighting foams too. It's been banned now, but it's also in other things like quick release agents. So it ends up in our food supply because it travels through the wastewater treatment plants and ends up in the solids that they package, and some places they sell to be put onto farmers or people's gardens, and then it gets taken up by the vegetables and it ends up in the food supply. So we're trying to address that through legislation too, but he's going to be giving a presentation that talks about that. Okay, so also, I just wanted to highlight that I did write an essay, and the Press and Sun Bulletin Binghamton area newspaper was nice enough to publish it within just 5 days after I submitted them. That was super lucky. And basically, this essay reiterates the poor decisions that New York has made over the last year that are in the wrong direction related to following its own climate law. And at the end of it, I basically say that, what I just urge people to do is contact their elected officials, governor, assembly member, state senators, DEC officials, Public Service Commission, and tell them that you want New York's climate law upheld so that New Yorkers can thrive now and into the future with safe, affordable, renewable energy. It's not that we don't have the technology. The technology has been around and it's gotten so cheap now that it's even cheaper than existing fossil fuel fired power plants in many cases. So there's really no excuse not to build more renewable energy. All right. So now I'm going to give a little bit of a quick lesson, only about 10 slides, on recent changes in state and federal freshwater wetlands laws. Let's see. So unlike the federal program for protection of wetlands, the state program about wetlands has been relatively stable up until just a few years ago, when long sought for legislation was finally passed to change the amount of wetlands that are subject to state protection from a minimum of 12.4 acres down to, I think, 7 acres now is the minimum. And also they changed it so that it's not, doesn't have to be mapped. The DEC can just say, okay, this wetland deserves to be protected. So as of January 1st of 2023, permit application fees went up. Beginning of this year, they eliminated the requirement for wetlands to be mapped in advance. So now the DEC can decide to protect certain wetlands on their own. There's criteria that was established. So anything that is designated a wetland of unusual importance cannot be protected by the DEC. And the actual figure is 7.4 acres. Any wetland that's 7.4 acres minimum now has to be protected, according to the state. I guess I'm going to skip over this. This is supposedly they've already issued the regulations. And then this slide is basically it's up to the landowner to prove if there is a doubt that your wetland is not required to be protected. So you have to show that it doesn't really fall into the categories, that you can't assume that I can do whatever I want. I can just fill in a wetland. And you'd have to go through talking with a wetlands biologist with the DEC to confirm whether or not your wetland is or is not regulated by the state. And this is similar to what you have to go through for federal wetlands too. But the state also regulates if you've within 100 feet an upland adjacent area surrounding the wetland. And then this is criteria now. What is a wetland that is of unusual importance? So one of those is if the wetland is located in a watershed that has experienced significant flooding in the past or is expected to experience significant flooding in the future from severe storm events, which keep getting worse from climate change, then that could be a reason why it would be a particularly important wetland to protect. If it's located within or adjacent to an urban area, as defined by the United States Census Bureau. If it contains a plant species occurring in fewer than 35 sites statewide or having fewer than 5,000 total number of individuals of that species in the entire state. Another criteria would be if it contains habitat for an essential behavior of an endangered or threatened species, like reproducing, or a species of special concern as defined under section 11-0535 of this chapter. And I should mention that this is from a law firm, Whiteman, Osterman, and Hanna, LLP, attorneys at law, and it was put out April 8th of 2024. So I know nobody's going to remember all this, but I just wanted to highlight the important stuff. So thank you for them for putting this together. If it's classified by the DEC as a Class 1 wetlands, that's another potential criteria that could deem it to be specially protected, even if it's smaller than 7.4 acres. If it was previously classified and mapped by the department as far as being of unusual local importance, if it's a vernal pool that is known to be a breeding ground for amphibians, frogs, toads, salamanders, if it is located in an area designated as a floodway on the most current digital flood insurance rate map produced by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, if it was previously mapped by the department as a wetlands on or before December 31st, 2024, if it has wetland functions and values that are of local or regional significance, and I don't really know what that specifically means, but there's the sentence. It is determined by the commissioner to be of significant importance to protecting the state's water quality. So those are the things that I wanted to review, just so you have a flavor of what's going on with wetlands. The state now has the authority to regulate and protect many more wetlands than it did prior to the beginning of this year. So that's a good thing overall, because wetlands do serve important functions regarding the environment, wildlife, regulating carbon uptake, and it can also give off a lot of CO2 and methane, which is bad for climate. So With that, I want to introduce Dr. Amy Churchill, who was nice enough to agree to give us this presentation tonight. She is going to give a presentation on the ecosystem services of northern wetlands. Wetlands cover a small fraction of the terrestrial area of Earth, but play a large role in controlling carbon, water, and nutrient cycling in ways that benefit humans. These benefits to people, also known as ecosystem services, are under threat due to climate change and land use change. Greenhouse gas emissions such as CO2 and methane from wetlands can also make climate change worse, so they are important to understand. Dr. Amy Churchill is an assistant professor in the Environmental Studies program at Binghamton University in New York. Her research interests are focused on interactions between plant ecology and ecosystem functions or services responding to global change drivers. Her past experiences have focused on a range of applied ecological contexts in systems as varied as lawns and pastures to boreal peatlands, far removed from direct human impacts. Her research merges ecological theory around community succession and plant species interactions with concepts of ecosystem resistance and resilience in the face of extreme drought. She did this at the Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve in Minnesota. And also, she has worked on continuous warming. This was at the Pastures and Climate Extremes Project in New South Wales, Australia. Elevated CO2 conditions at Hawkesbury Institute for the Environment, also at New South Wales, Australia, and nitrogen deposition at Rocky Mountain Alpine in Colorado, USA. So thank you, Dr. Amy Churchill, and I'm going to let you give us your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. So today we're going to be focusing on talking about the ecosystem services that are provided by northern wetlands. And we're going to step through some discussion about what wetlands are, how do we delineate the different types of wetlands, how do we classify them, what's unique about them, what are their functions, what are those services that benefits people get from the existence of wetlands. And we're going to focus a little bit especially on a particular type of wetland known as peatlands, which is a system that I did my master's work on at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. So to just give everyone a little context for my research program and where I'm coming from, I am a little advanced. Go. Let's go. Oh. Go. It's gonna work. It's gonna work. Go. Oh, but this is more fancy. All right, that's fine. Nope, still not working. We've got a lot of animation, so this could be interesting. So I work at the interface between plant and ecosystem ecology, and we've got our lovely hypothetical ecosystem here. What that means is that I'm very interested in the ways in which plants interact with ecosystems. This includes the abiotic component of an ecosystem. That's the water, the nutrients, the light availability, those kinds of things, the soil, as well as the biotic component. And mostly I think about plants, but of course this includes the insects and the herbivores that are interacting with and living on these plants as part of these ecosystems. And I look at these interactions in the context specifically of ecosystem functions, so the ways that ecosystems are operating and the sorts of resources that they're working with, and in terms of ecosystem services, which are the benefits humans get from the natural processes that are happening in ecosystems. And I look at this in the context of global change, and so as was mentioned, I've worked in the context of drought and elevated CO2 and heat waves and warming and nitrogen additions and all of these different types of varied global change drivers. And today we're going to be focusing on a range of ways that wetland systems are impacted related to humans. And we're going to focus a little bit on, in particular, climate impacts for northern peatland systems from some of the work that I had done in Australia. Or sorry, not in Australia, in Alaska. All right, so just to give everybody a little bit of a map about where I've been. So you can see here all of the little blue dots indicate places that I've worked. And that includes a variety of different ecosystems, including things like California vernal pools, as well as pastures and rangeland in Australia. And now here in New England, now that I've joined working in New York, I'm actually working in lawn ecosystems, which are a completely different context, where we have a really close interaction between humans and these spaces. And I do this work with a lot of people, and so I'd like to include this slide really early on to acknowledge, oops, back. We want to see all the cool people. Okay, we want to acknowledge that the research that I've been doing is really dependent on large groups of people all around the world. And I want to acknowledge their contributions to the kinds of things that I'm presenting. So I measure all kinds of things related to ecosystems. I'm not really going to show you a whole lot of methods-y type slides, but I'm happy to talk more about how do we quantify these things in a wetland versus in a grassland versus in a forest, because those can be very different depending on the context for how do we quantify a carbon flux, for example. So what is a wetland? We have all probably a mental image of what a wetland looks like. And there are some really lovely sort of images that document these diagrams online. And we can sort of look at the relative water table associated with changes in vegetation that help us delineate where the water is. And officially, the definition of a wetland is really about whether you've got water or not. The water does not need to be continuously present year-round, but there does need to be water at least for some period of time every year with some regularity. So a vernal pool, for example, is only flooded for a portion of the year, but it refloods every year. In contrast, this is a pond, but of course it's got wetland around the edges, where we've got this transition from a pondish lake through a marsh and other types of wetland ecosystems that are all playing different roles in the broader natural community. So what are some things that we have to consider when you're talking about the types of wetlands? There are a few important details. One of those is the type of plants that are actually living there. Are they big plants, aka trees? Are they little plants? Or are they like just covering the ground that wouldn't hit your ankles? Or are we talking about wading through a swamp full of really tall rushes or reeds where it's about your height, but they're all something that we would consider herbaceous that are going to die back every year? So the type of vegetation is very important. Also, the type of soil. So this especially relates to, is your soil primarily comprised of clay, silt, or sand? Or is it primarily comprised of organic material? Think of the compost that you're putting in your garden. Depending on the relative amount of organic to inorganic, which is all of those other three categories, that can be a really important determining factor in the type of wetland that you're working with. How much water there is also plays a really important role. How deep is it? How long do you have water? Is it fresh water or is it salt water? This also plays a role in many of the ways that we delineate types of wetlands. And then finally, the slope. So that relationship between upland ecosystems and then the wetland community itself. Is this gradual where you see a lot of fluctuation? Is the slope in fact collapsing into your wetland? Or is the wetland expanding in some other way? Or is it very constrained, either because it was man-made or some other geographic features? Knowing this kind of information is super important because it tells us more information about the ecology of the wetland. And knowing that ecology is going to tell us what's going on in terms of these functions and the kinds of benefits that people get from them. So where do we find wetlands? This is a pretty old map, and so sadly this means that this distribution is probably much smaller today, being over 2 decades old. However, you can see that where we're located, we've got a decent percentage of wetlands within the state of New York, and then a lot of wetlands that sort of comprise the northern portion of North America, and those are especially the kinds of wetlands that we're going to be talking about today. So, in general, wetlands cover between 5 and 8% of the total land area on Earth. That's not a whole lot of space. Even because of this, they account for a really big impact on a whole range of benefits to humans, as well as functions that are happening in the natural world related to biodiversity, as well as all of this cycling of things like water and carbon and nutrients. They're varied. Wetlands can be very diverse. So here are just some pretty pictures. So here we've got a primarily grass or brush looking wetland. Here we've got lots of trees in this wetland. Slightly different looking. Again, these are all example pictures of New York wetlands. So this one's obviously coastal. We've got a lighthouse in our image here. And again, lots of trees. So we've got open ecosystems that are wetlands, and then we've got forested ecosystems that are wetlands. These are both different types, and they're going to provide different functions. If we move further north, here are some further examples. These are both peatland pictures that show, again, a very different system. Different kinds of trees. So what do wetlands do in general and for us? We can think of this in terms of ecosystem functions. These are the natural processes that are happening inside ecosystems, and the ecosystem services. And this is the benefits humans get because those natural spaces exist and the ecosystems are continuing to work. What do these include? Ecosystem functions include energy flow. So this is plants grow, bugs eat them, birds eat the bugs, hawks eat the birds. A bear decides to eat some hawk chicks. You know, you get the whole cascade of interactions between species associated with transferring that energy. We also have water, carbon, and nutrient cycling that are all innate processes that are going on in ecosystems. Water is moving from the open water source, it's evaporating, becoming clouds, and it's cycling back again after it precipitates, right? So we've got these cycles that are innately part of what's going on in ecosystems. And probably many folks here are thinking also about the carbon cycle and how wetland spaces interact with the carbon cycle. And that's something that we're going to look at in more detail. So how do these relate to the benefits people get? It's nice to know that, you know, carbon is moving through this natural area, but how does it actually relate to you? The way we primarily think about ecosystem services are associated with four main categories.
I did.
These include supporting ecosystem services, regulating, provisioning, and cultural ecosystem services. Our ecosystem functions generally translate into these supporting ecosystem services. And that's in order to have all the rest of these services, we need to have those functions being maintained. You have to have some baseline of a functioning ecosystem to get some benefits out of it. And so this is how these concepts are connected to each other. So what do these ecosystem functions look like in wetlands? Water cycle is a very intuitive process. We know that water moves from being a liquid to a gas, and it's moving through different components. We've got it inside plants, it's in the soil, it's in the clouds, and it follows this lovely cycle. In wetland systems, this infiltration into the water table is a really important component of how we use and benefit these wetland areas, because this is how the water moves to recharge our aquifers. Nutrient cycling is a little bit more complicated. You don't have to worry about all of these processes. I make my students report the cycle to me, but what it relates to is how nitrogen, how phosphorus is moving between the soil, how it's moving from being taken up and used by plants or other organisms in the ecosystem, and then ultimately being re-released into the atmosphere. Now that may be related to reproducing N2, which is the form of nitrogen that's the most common in the air. The air you breathe is 70% N2. But of course, if we're thinking about the carbon component, that's also related to our uptake and loss of CO2 or carbon dioxide and methane. So this relates a lot in wetland systems to the presence or absence of oxygen. Wetlands are very unique because they're wet. You can't have a lot of air in areas where you have water because there's less oxygen dissolved in water than there is in air. This process alters how all of these different nutrients are cycled. And so we have this entire zone in a wetland where we have what's called anaerobic or without oxygen soil. This presence allows us to slow down decomposition so we don't get all this CO2 loss, and that's where the whole methane thing comes about. So having this anaerobic soil or areas that don't have access to oxygen is a really important part of how ecosystems function in wetlands. That's really unique. And this is why wetlands are known as the kidneys of the natural world, because they're sort of taking in all of these excess nutrients, processing them, and then either converting them into something that has no impact, N2, which is what we like to have, or if we get a byproduct, which is that N2O, which is in itself a greenhouse gas. So nutrient cycling in wetlands is very important. Of course, carbon is going to play a huge role, and we're going to keep talking about the carbon cycle. So how do these relate to ecosystem services? If we're thinking about these beautiful spaces, we've just covered the idea of supporting services. This is that carbon cycling, water cycling, nutrient cycling aspect. But what about some of these other services that wetland ecosystems provide? So this includes the idea of flood mitigation. This is probably why in those updated laws, areas that are prone to flooding are especially considered as being special protection classes within the state of New York. Flooding is a huge concern, and consequently, flood mitigation is why we really like wetlands. They're also really important for things like erosion control, because again, they're slowing down flowing water and they're reducing soil loss in many spaces. They promote groundwater recharge, so that's that infiltration aspect where the water table is then allowing us to refill those aquifers that then make water available for us for a whole range of uses. We also, very importantly, have water purification processes. So this is related to that nutrient cycling, where often you can actually have natural wetlands that are specifically designed, man-made even, to remove excess nutrients from a water flow or water source, and then sort of pump them out to just producing all this N2 gas so that we no longer have all this excess nutrients. So this filtration aspect is really, really important. And then finally, or maybe not finally, there's many, but we also have climate regulations. And so for wetlands and peatlands in particular, the ability to sequester carbon, that is, take more carbon in than you lose, is a very important ecosystem service provided by wetlands. And finally, again, this waste assimilation related to nutrient removal is another really important aspect of these spaces. But besides these regulatory services, we also get some provisioning. So this is some of the fun stuff. So this looks like subsistence. This might be for hunters who enjoy being able to select waterfowl for hunting and then eating. But this also relates to harvesting for fish if they exist in these different spaces, but also plants, things like cranberries, cranberry bogs. Very nice thing. We all like our cranberries come Thanksgiving. Where do cranberries come from? Wetlands. Also, rice. We have native rice in North America, and there are entire communities who are very interested and invested in being able to harvest that native rice. And so this is a service associated with provisioning. There are also commercial uses that we gain from wetland spaces. So this, of course, relates to those food, the fish, the fiber, things like wood, straw. So most of the Northeast, especially when originally colonization was happening, all of these coastal marshes were harvested for straw. That completely and fundamentally altered the coastal ecosystems, but there were these lovely beds of all of this lovely luscious rush that then they could use to thatch houses or to feed cattle. And consequently, that was an important commercial aspect of wetlands, even during the early days of when European settlers were arriving. But we also harvest peat. And this is something we're going to be revisiting many times. Peat, this is some lovely imaging, sort of showing how that process looks. But this is the removal of very organic soil from a wetland that is either currently growing or has been basically destroyed because we're extracting it. And this is one of the primary things that we have to think about when you're using any kind of organic soil sources or mulches that contain peat. That peat came from somewhere, and it is no longer acting as peat once you've added it to your garden. Finally, and very challenging to quantify, there are a lot of cultural services that we get from wetlands. What do these things look like? They're pretty. We like hiking on boardwalks and walking through wetland spaces, right? We can see lots of interesting birds. We can see interesting plants. We might elect to canoe through these spaces because often there's some standing water in them. And so culturally, they're very lovely to visit. We also, and importantly, have cultural relationships with these spaces, especially related to the use of things like the wild rice for indigenous populations. And so again, there's a lot of meaning in a wetland. So how much is all this worth? There are a lot of different estimates of what is the worth of wetlands. At a global scale, and this is an estimate aimed at the forested varieties of wetlands in particular, there are some estimates that say as much as $500 billion are associated with the worth of a wetland. We can sort of look at a couple different ways of thinking about it. If we think about in storm protection in particular, these are for coastal, so saltwater-based wetlands. We sort of still get this $23 billion worth. $7 saved for every dollar spent. This is particularly important for conservation efforts. And then also in general, every sort of 2.5 acres is worth just shy of $1 million in terms of those ecosystem services that we get back from them. So the sort of amount of money you get from doing some actions for these ecosystems can be very important. And there are a whole bunch of different ways we can quantify things. Are we talking about different types? Are we talking coastal systems, inland wetlands versus mangroves, or other kinds of wetland systems that interface with a river versus a pond versus the ocean? Now, of course, not all wetlands are created equally. They are varied. And as you'll have noticed throughout many of these pictures, some of our wetlands have trees. Some of them have a bit more water than others. And we can use, again, this type of vegetation to classify the kinds of wetlands that we're working with. And that's going to be related to the kinds of ecosystem services that humans get from those spaces. So very nicely, if you've got trees, it's a swamp. That makes it nice and straightforward. If your soil does not have a whole lot of organic content in it, then you're talking about a marsh. And if you've got lots of organic material in your soil, nice dark brown here, we're talking about a peatland. So these are our three main types of wetlands, and of particular importance for climate regulation and for carbon cycling, we're going to focus a bit more further on peatlands. So peatlands at a global scale represent 3% of the total land area, very small. It accounts for 1/3 of all terrestrial carbon. That's a lot. So a few details about these spaces. To define our types of wetlands, you need to know whether or not you have trees. We need to think about the soil type. Do you have mostly inorganic soil, or is it how much peat is there, how much organic material? Where is the water coming from? Now, this is very important when we're looking within when we're defining the types of peatlands. And what I mean here is your water coming from the ground, where you've got the water table, where you've got a tide bringing in your water source, and the water is coming from elsewhere? Or is your water primarily coming from precipitation, where the only way that new water enters your ecosystem is actually just coming from either snow or rain? This is very important because that's going to control how many nutrients are coming into this ecosystem in your water. We can sort of plot all of these together and start separating out how they are related to each other. So if we've got primarily a rain source of water, that's going to be associated with not a whole lot of variation in water because it's only coming from rain events. Unless you've got a big deluge, you've sort of got a baseline amount of rain water coming in. Rain, however, in most parts of the country or most parts of North America doesn't have a whole lot of nutrients in it. And so consequently, bogs are very low in nutrient availability. They also are very acidic, and they've got lots and lots and lots of organic material in their soil. We can shift to fens. This is another classification of peatlands. These are now connected. So fens are actually linked in with your water table, and there's going to be an influx of water coming from surrounding rivers or ponds that are impacting the nutrient availability in your fens. And so in this case, there's a bit more nutrients available, they're less acidic, and they've got a little bit less peat. As we move from swamps to marshes, that trend continues. So by the time we're looking at a marsh, we've got lots of surface water. We can canoe through a lovely marsh. We've got high fluctuation, think of tidal marshes, where you've got the tides changing on a daily basis. And we've got many more nutrients that we're thinking about. But we also have many fewer amounts of sort of that organic material that's built up in these systems. So if we're thinking specifically about these bogs and fens, where are they? On a global scale, you're going to notice an interesting pattern related to all of these darker shades on this map. Are they primarily north? Or are they primarily south? North, right? Very importantly, most of our peatlands are in the northern hemisphere. The ones that are further south, and especially the ones that are closer to the equator, generally are facing very different threats than the ones that we're more familiar with in North America. We define a peatland based on the amount of organic material in the soil. And so in this beautiful picture, you have to be dominated by peat, that is having really organic soil that is deeper than a foot. If you meet that cutoff and that threshold, then this is officially classified as a peatland. So having all this organic material, how did these peatlands come about? This is our glacial extent in North America, the last glacial maximum. As the glacier retreated, we were left with a variety of lower sections of the landscape that enabled the formation of a variety of peatlands. And so consequently, as those glaciers retreated, we got the formation of all of these peatland complexes across North America. So how do they form in the first place? Peatlands, being comprised primarily of organic soil, are associated where you've got plant material, we've got a water level, and very importantly, there's very limited oxygen. Now, regular breakdown processes of plant litter, if you've got oxygen, it's going to decompose. You're going to release all the CO2 that the plant took up. When we don't have oxygen, that decomposing process slows down. And as a consequence, we can start accumulating carbon. And so now we've got our dead plants, and they are not decomposing. In fact, they're just accumulating over time. And so because of the low oxygen, all of that carbon stays in the soil. Over time, many, many years, this is going to start to accumulate. And so if we think about 1,000 years in different places is going to be about how long it takes to make a meter worth of peat. So this is a long process. And for those of us who have peatlands here in North America, these peatlands have been accumulating since the last glacial maximum. And so they've been accumulating for quite a period of time. So we've got these two types of peatlands. We've got fens that have connected water bodies, so they're getting nutrients from outside. And we've got bogs, where the water is only coming from precipitation, snow or rain. And these have maybe more organic material, but they're highly acidic and, again, very nutrient poor. So now we get to think a little bit about, well, why are these places so interesting and special? And so I'm going to give us a little bit of a slideshow to talk through who lives in these spaces. So the very important friend of peatlands is, of course, our very close friend, the sphagnum moss. And here you can see a couple different species in this picture, but there are also many other varieties of moss that play a very important role in all of this organic material buildup. So these are brown mosses or feather mosses, all present in different types of peatlands in different areas. We also have a variety of different sedges and grasses. So this is a cotton grass. And here are some beautiful sedges, again, that are very common, especially in fens. And so we've got a really interesting but very short-statured plant community that's sort of living at our ground level in these systems. But we also have some very showy friends. So here we can start to see some different flowers that live in this space. This is another really beautiful boreal species that's pink. It's sort of showing up as pink here, but know that they're very beautiful and they're sort of a bell shape. This is another evergreen shrub in the boreal forest. And this is probably a species that we have here, at least when I was a master's student, these were known as ledum. I think today that they are part of the rhododendron genus, but they're very beautiful and showy in about a month. And then of course, we also have species like blueberries. Blueberries like that acidic soil, right? We have a whole variety of aquatic species. So this is a ponytilla or a cinquefoil species that's blooming over here with very cryptic flowers. We also have things like bladderworts that live and grow in the water column that are still contributing this carbon back into these ecosystems. But because these are very nutrient-poor spaces, we also get some very cool plants. These include many of the carnivorous plants, that is, the plants that eat bugs. They are required to do this because they aren't able to get enough nutrients from the soil. And so consequently, they've evolved to be able to make use of all of these tasty goodies from killing off the very hordes of insects that live in these wet spaces. So here we have a couple examples. This is Drosera or sundew. So these operate like the Venus flytrap. You have some sad, unfortunate little friend that gets stuck in the stickies, and then it'll eventually get digested after the little hairs roll into the central pad. We also have pitcher plants that are very common. And here we actually have water that's accumulated usually by precipitation of some sort, and then organisms fall in to the pitcher and then are slowly and gradually digested by the plant. And there are some very cool mutualisms with spiders interacting with these. There are in the more tropical areas, there are rodents that will interface with various pitcher plants, especially ones that live sort of not in the soil. So carnivorous plants do some very cool things, but they're also usually unique to the specific type of wetland they're in. So they're often some of the more endangered and rare plants that we find in wetlands and peatlands in particular. But of course, we've got more than just plants. We've got our lovely friends, the mosquitoes, our mozzies, if I'm using my Australian lingo. And especially when we're thinking about those farther north areas, those mozzies get very, very large. And so here, this is just an example image that I found online, but the mozzies can get very, very big and very, very dense in these spaces. We also have some fun visitors. So these are some sandhill cranes that we were regularly encountering in our peatlands in Minnesota while I was working on a project there. But besides just the birds and the bugs, we also get some larger guests into these wetland spaces. And so here we might have a nice iconic gathering of moose who are taking advantage of all those excellent and tasty vegetation that are in a fairly shallow area where they can be wandering around that's pretty open. So what is so great about these peatlands? What does a peatland do? In particular, the northern peatlands represent a net carbon sink. That is, they're taking in more carbon than they are losing, at least at the present. And that at the present is exactly where we are continuing to conduct research today. They have been doing this since those glaciers retreated. And so here in North America, that's generally for the last 8,000 to 11,000 years. So quite a long time, they've been this continuous sink of carbon. Where do we find this carbon? So here's some of the most data intensive graph I'm going to show you today. I had nothing to do with it. Other people made this figure. So here we're looking at a heat map of soil organic carbon across the world. Red, warmer colors indicate that there's more carbon stored in the soil. And as we've already noted, where do we find the carbon? in the north. So we're explicitly talking about soil carbon. Most of that carbon is stored in the high latitudes in peatlands. If we consider, so we're looking at accumulated carbon, and we take into account the above ground in green. This map is showing us by latitude, so 0 here being the equator. And we've got this beautiful peak of green and of course our rainforests in the tropics. We would expect to see this. And the order of magnitude of green, is decently large related to the rainforest. However, very importantly, there is a whole lot of carbon below ground at those small latitudes. This is important to know. But there's so much more carbon in the high latitudes in the soil. And this is again because you've had 11,000 years of accumulated, non-decomposed organic soil in these northern peatlands. So where do we find the most carbon? Again, 1/3 of all terrestrial carbon is found specifically in the peatland type of wetlands. So what's messing up, keeping all this lovely carbon in the soil? The current largest threat, and this is very evident with the kinds of changes in laws that have been implemented recently here in New York, is land use change. And so what this means is, as we convert a wetland from a lovely space into something that's now a parking lot or somebody's lawn, we're of course losing a lot of resources related to it functioning as an as a wetland. At a global scale, 80% of wetlands have been impacted in some way by human activities. That's a huge fraction of the total global wetlands. And sadly, 50% of wetlands have been destroyed just since 1900. And then estimates are saying that since 1970, within that, that's 35%. So a huge amount of this change is still happening in the fairly recent past. And that's sort of another consideration for where we're thinking about preventing further changes from happening. So this is a diagram that sort of shows the impacts of different drivers on wetlands at a global scale. And of course, many of these different categories are related to land use change. So this includes farming and urbanization, having cattle. These are all land use change type categories that are associated with changing processes in wetlands. Climate change is another contributing ongoing factor. And a number of the different categories on this map are related to that climate change. So this is climate change specific. Oh, my little thing changed. Go back. Climate change. Climate change. We have changes in fire regime. So fires in the tropical peatlands is the primary reason of loss for peatlands in the equator areas. But also things like sea level change are going to impact our coastal communities. But then we also have these changes in pollution, so things like oil spills, industry, all of these land use change factors that also have byproducts that are going to be impacting these wetland spaces. And then finally, we've got some introduction of invasive species. So locally, that's things like Phragmites, which is this ginormous grass that takes over and sort of chokes out waterways. Also, we've got things like purple loosestrife, which can take over areas that formerly were cattails, right? So we've got a whole variety of invasive species that are fundamentally changing the processes that are happening in wetlands. My former research focused on the impacts of climate change, and particular changes in the availability of water. And I'm gonna just sort of check us on time because we're approaching 8 and I can like pause or like slow, or how do we want to proceed?
I think you can keep going.
Okay.
We don't have to stop at 8.
Okay.
Yeah.
Lovely. Okay, so I'm gonna be conscious of time so that I'm not keeping people very long, but also maybe at this point, if you have immediate questions, we can sort of start having a bit more interaction. So the work that I had done focused on climate change in the past was specifically focused on the idea that we're going to see changes in water availability in peatland areas. And so this means sometimes it's going to be very dry. So this is a picture from a fen where I did my master's work, where we had almost no rain for the entire summer of 2009. That's unheard of for that area. It was a 1 in 100 year drought.
This was where?
This is in Fairbanks, Alaska.
Oh.
Yep. Subsequently, we had a massive flood. And actually, I shouldn't say subsequently, it was before this. Before this, we had a 100-year flood. So this is the same site, almost the same angle, and you can see the difference in water table. So not only are we going to get drier or wetter, or both, we're going to see an increase in the fluctuations between being dry and wet. And this is going to have a huge impact on all of these processes that are happening in these spaces. But it's more than just water that's changing, also temperature. And so working in the boreal forests up in Alaska, we have a type of soil that we're not really going to go into a ton of detail, but is known as permafrost. This is soil that's permanently frozen, that is below 0 degrees Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit for the entire year. Once the permafrost warms up, which it is happening at a global scale, it starts to thaw. That frozen soil then that contains all of this lovely ice, eventually the ice will melt out, and this causes the ground to subside. So we move from more of a forested peatland, where the water table is below the rooting depth of some of these trees, and we transition into a different, this is more of a boggy type system, where now we're no longer having trees, and we get a change in the kinds of plants that are living in this space. So we get a change in water table related to this change in temperature. And so this is known as a thermokarst formation, and this just sort of shows you a picture. Here is our peatland that has trees, and then here is our peatland once all the trees have already died. So I worked at the Alaskan Peatland Experiment for my master's work, and we were really interested in this few primary questions related to what the impact of changes in hydrology was on the plants. So how did the plant community change? But then also, especially related to the structure, so is it grasses or sedges or moss, who's living there? And then also that carbon, how much carbon was being taken up by the plants and by the ecosystem, which is known as ecosystem productivity. So we measured a whole bunch of things with lots and lots of people. Here's us collecting various fluxes of greenhouse gases. So you've got some images so you have an idea about how they're collected. So here is our little boxes that we trap gases in, and then we're quantifying the changes in carbon over time using computer programs that are calculating the net changes in carbon, either that's being taken up by the plants or that's being lost from the ecosystem. And we found some pretty striking things. So we saw some really big changes in the plants when we droughted, which is the takeaway associated with this figure. Lower here is our droughted treatment, where we actually physically removed water from our peatland to see what changes that prompted in the plant community. And that stayed really consistent when we just looked at the new growth that was happening. And this was because our sedges here grew way more in the drier space than they did in the other two, either control conditions or when we flooded the peatland. This translated into some interesting changes in the ecosystem productivity. So this is the flux of carbon that's being taken up by the plants and stored in the ecosystem itself. So negative values here indicate more carbon being taken up by the ecosystem. So in general, one thing you'll see is there's a ton of interannual variability. Again, because 2008 was the flood, and it impacted things into 2009, and then 2009 we got no rain that then carried over with its impacts into 2010. So tons of important interannual variation, but in general, the raised water area, so the areas that we flooded relative to the control, were able to take up more carbon than certainly our drought. So our droughted area was taking up much less carbon regularly in comparison to the flooded areas. What about in our bog? So this is our very nutrient poor area. When we have intact permafrost, we've got a whole lot of different types of plants existing in our permafrost peatland area. And so we've got more types of plants present. When we lose the permafrost, we're comparing these two, you can see we have changes in how that plant community is structured. And when we sort of look further at the new growth that's just happened in the last year, we see really big changes, especially in, again, the sedge community, as being really responsive to changes in permafrost loss. We lose the permafrost, there's tiny amounts of sedges here, but when we look in our collapsed areas where there's no more permafrost, we get way more sedges. And this related, of course, to the carbon uptake as well. We had a lot of intra-annual variability here. Similarly, but our youngest thermokarst, so the area that the permafrost had been lost the most recently, was also sequestering the most carbon on average.
I just had a little lightning stroke in my brain.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, this may fool people into thinking that things are not so bad because the new collapse areas are sucking up more carbon than the old permafrost that remain frozen. And then you're going to be followed that with this old collapse, which is going to be taking up less carbon. And what you haven't talked about yet is reactivation of decomposition, which may produce more CO2 release and probably more methane release too.
Absolutely. So I'm only talking about what plants were taking up,
Yeah,
not the net balance
yeah. So
of carbon.
I hope you're going to get to the carbon bomb.
Carbon bomb.
Which
Well,
is our future.
Well, really, there are some concerns, especially with permafrost. The other important aspect here is that we have trees in the permafrost, and these numbers that I'm reporting are not including trees or shrubs. I'm only talking about sort of what can fit in a box size of plants, right? And so this is a portion of the total photosynthesis that can be happening in these systems. So we see the importance of peatlands and wetlands more generally in associations with carbon sequestration and how that's maybe related to changes in the plants because of things like climate change. And we've got some interesting local, closer to home applications of the importance of ecosystem services. And so this is something that I learned now that I live here, related to the Catskill Delaware watershed idea of being able to provide filtration services to New York City, which is a very important ecosystem service that is supporting, of course, having access to safe drinking water on a continuous scale for a huge portion of the population of our state. And so with that, I'll leave you with a lovely picture of an Alaska peatland, and I'll highlight, although it's very hard to see, but this lovely white mound over here is actually Mount Denali, which is the tallest mountain in North America.
Okay, so yeah,
Yeah.
to follow up with my question, what do you think, how close are we to having massive increasing release of methane in particular from the northern regions, not just the peat areas, but even just the other permafrost that's up there and the forested areas?
Absolutely. So methane, which is another form of carbon that's produced during decomposition. That's so you're breaking up organic material and you're turning it back into something inorganic. You're moving it from a living plant, like a dead plant bit, into a smaller fraction. Methane is only produced in anaerobic or oxygen-free environments. And so it can only happen in spaces that are fully saturated. That means it is an ongoing process that happens in peatlands. But it also means that you only have that particular same band that can be accessible to producing methane at any amount of time. So different types of carbon are going to promote or not the loss of methane. Different vegetation structures also can support the production of loss of carbon from ecosystems related to methane. With the permafrost aspect, as the permafrost thaws and you're getting this more carbon, unless that is wet, we wouldn't have methane as a problem. We'll be losing CO2, but not methane. The methane requires there to be more water. If we don't have more water, which is likely the case if we're dealing with drought, methane no longer becomes a problem.
Yeah, and the precipitation patterns are changing too. Some areas are getting more wet, and
Yes.
I don't know if that's going to be in general in the northern regions or not. I don't know.
More in the northeast. I think the continental section less so. And then Alaska is also fairly variable. It's most of the precipitation patterns there are more a shift from snow to rain, which is going to drive a lot of functional changes because, of course, my field season in Alaska started in the second week of June and ended in the third week in August.
The other problem that we're gonna see more of is, fires in those regions that won't go out even in winter. And
That is,
they'll reignite, when it dries out and
Yes.
more, sun happens, to be shining.
yes. And that is a huge concern. So when the water table drops, when you've drained a peatland or you've otherwise removed that water table, when the fire comes through, now there's a lot more oxygen in there. And now all of that glorious organic material is combustible. As long as it stays wet, and it's a really great thing when you're doing peatland ecology and you're walking around, we call them hummocks. And these are the mounds of sphagnum and moss that you can walk on. And then you've got lawns that are lower. The hummocks stay wet because the moss is wicking water up, and so they don't burn. Whereas the lawns, if the water is dried out, then those are more often to be carrying fire, and that's where the peat fire concept comes into play. But once it dries out, that's where the fire can come in and take hold.
So one of them should be.
Yes. Yep. Yes. Absolutely.
$5 to 8% seems very small.
Yes. Global wetlands in general. Yep. Not a whole lot of land area there. Mhm.
A huge amount of carbon, which is really surprising to me. It's so much more than, all the tropical rainforests put together. It's like multiple, like maybe 10 times as much, just
Well, it's of the soil carbon. Yeah.
ballpark anyway.
Yeah, because it's a third of all terrestrial carbon is found in peatlands. Yep.
Hi, this is Scott from Zoomland. Amy, this may not be your area, but for protection of wetlands in New York State, the Farm Bureau has opposed it. I guess because it takes away what they feel is good farmland. But can you think of, let's say, benefits of wetlands to farmland that could persuade them that that they can coexist with wetlands?
Few important ways. One, of course, is that water recharge. So having wetlands enables you to have a water table to then irrigate your crops. Or provide a water table if you aren't irrigating and you're relying on a natural water body to be supplying the source of water for your crops. That's a very important aspect. But then also we have lots and lots of pollinators. As much as we all like to think about mosquitoes only relying on human blood, right? They're also very important pollinators. And so these wetland places also serve as important pollinator, basically sources for potentially any kind of sort of insect pollinator based crops. So that's another way in which wetlands are providing a service specific to agriculture, sort of, it's of course happening in natural ecosystems too, but that's another important resource.
Okay, thank you.
Another thing too, which isn't a direct natural thing that a farmer might care about, but overall humanity wants to reduce the amount of excess nutrients that go into streams and rivers and end up in the ocean too. The Gulf of Mexico is particularly overwhelmed. A lot of it is from runoff from farms, excess of fertilizer. So if a farmer preserves their wetlands, that can help absorb a lot of this nutrient material and keep it from running away in streams and then eventually rivers and then eventually the Gulf of Mexico in the case of that,
Yeah.
system, river system.
Yeah.
So that's something that I know there are regulations that are designed to try to prevent excess runoff, and people that have lawns, golf courses, they should worry about this more as well, but people don't worry about it enough, and that's nowhere near regulated as well as it should be. But that's also a thing that wetlands help control, and I really hope people take lessons from all of this and learn to appreciate the small area that we have left, considering how much of it we've wasted away needlessly and carelessly. I hope that we preserve what we have left.
Yeah, that's the kidney, the kidney of the world, right? Is where we can process all of these excess nutrients and get rid of them.
One question in the chat, and is there a significant local wetland which can be visited?
So the question for those folks online, if you weren't able to hear, is are there significant local wetlands that can be visited? And at least to me, as a Binghamton University person, I'll sort of give a shout out to the preserve, the campus preserve. And so we do have a whole series of wetlands there surrounding a pond. And that area is very nice. And there are lots of others in the area that I'm sure people maybe would like to recommend your favorite local source of visiting.
In Lyle, just past Dorchester, first left, there's a lot of wetlands in there.
Okay, lovely.
Yeah, Brick Pond in Owego, people love that place too to visit, and then Waterman Conservation Center has some wetlands they help take care of. In between Route 17, there's a wetland that has been preserved for a long time, and it was actually saved by Harriet Marcy, the mother of Rick Marcy, who wrote nature columns for a long time in the local newspaper. And so that's a wetland that people can visit. That's a beautiful place to go, and it's sheltered from deer because of the highways on both sides. So you see a lot of wildflowers in the spring that you otherwise wouldn't see because the deer would just decimate it all. So I recommend checking that place out.
The largest wetland in Boone County is Bowland Pond. But it's mostly private, and it's been allowed to get some of the property owners really destroyed it between quarries, and now there's a garbage disposal area where large storage containers that may not be empty or being but it was also a good place for cemetery.
Yeah,
Because it's easy to take,
right.
Oh,
so they have cemeteries, and that's actually the only place you can see the wetland. There's two large cemeteries on Upper Front Street, and you can go and see the wetlands through those because nobody's gonna take you out there. And so and one of the cemeteries is over 100 acres, so you can wander around quite a lot and see they have pothole ponds in there, and they have marshes. So, and they also have an escrow. So you can walk through there, but the rest of the wetland, which is over 100 acres, I think it's like 120. Most of it's no trespassing, although people do trespass. So, but one of the owners, I always tell people that trespass there that the owner lives on the hillside, so if he has a telescope, he can see you.
Right.
But as far as I know, he never gets anyone arrested, so feel free to trespass.
Gary said this.
But he can see there, he's right on the hillside, he can look right in. But the cemetery is already.
can you think of, I mean, I'm sure you're happy with the improvement in protection, or at least capability by the New York State, but do you think that we need to do even more than what what they did as far as the recent change in laws and regulations?
Well, I think related to land use, it'll help. But one thing we didn't really talk about here yet is the act of restoration in wetlands. And so that's a whole nother realm of research, is sort of going through and either creating from a new place to create a new wetland, or to take an area that's been degraded and then make it better. And that legislation around that, as either a climate mitigation practice or otherwise, is less clear. And so thinking about increasing the opportunities to restore or create these spaces, I think will ultimately go a long way in offsetting this continuous pattern of losing area of wetlands.
And the key place where there should be some regulations involved is the areas where they're building a new development, and then they create these water retention areas. Well, if you did that in the correct way,
Right.
that could be a very productive wetland, but if you don't care about that, all you need to do is just satisfy the minimum, then it ends up being not very good as far as a productive wetland. So I would hope that
Yeah.
maybe that's something that the Sierra Club and other environmental organizations can press for.
Yeah.
That to be a requirement as part of that, and there's so many things that we're pushing for right now,
Right.
that it's just,
One of many,
yeah.
but I would think that'll be my other like idea of
Okay.
ways to be thinking about wetlands and the ways we can maintain having these services sort of as a sort of into the future kind of a case, then thinking about ways that we can actually get some back. That's going to be a good future idea.
And then the other thing too is if we can keep people from hassling beavers.
Oh, well, that
Uh,
too. Keep the beavers, they're doing their job.
Because they
Yeah.
do a fantastic job, just
Yeah.
leave them alone, let
Yeah.
them be.
Yeah.
But some people just don't like the idea, and just bothers me.
Yeah, there's a nice success story, right, for the Northeast. We've got beavers back.
Yeah.
Well, that a lot of us to do with the fact that the birds.
Right, that does help. We're not just trying to kill them all the time, right? And, they don't have any predators really. It's just us killing them. So that makes it a little better.
Maybe we can convince people, where there are beavers, there's a lot less danger of forest fires. And that they've discovered that out west, and maybe they'll discover it back east too.
Yeah.
Because it's actually, they're fostering
Right.
beaver ponds out west, so.
Yeah.
Fires are becoming more of a problem here too.
How about the interest in the university and support of work such as what you've been doing, which is really amazingly in-depth, more than I would have even thought of. So,
Yep.
are they doing a good job? Do you think that they're going to continue supporting this type of research?
So,
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah. My research at the university for the present is focused on ecosystem services for different kind of ecosystem, lawns, grassland systems. But the university we've sort of had all these fun ongoing discussions about lawn management and practically sort of sustainable practices, reducing inputs of fertilizers, quantifying runoff. And so that's something they're very receptive to. Yep.
If there's anything we can help with that you have an idea, don't hesitate to contact us, because we are tied in with a lot of other environmental groups across New York State. And so just talking to one person and saying, hey, I got an idea, this needs to be done, please see if we can do something about it. Don't hesitate to contact us, okay?
Absolutely. That's great. Mhm.
Anybody else have any questions? What about online?
Well, have you studied the peak ponds in the Adirondacks? Pretty fun, activity.
I haven't. So sadly, I'm from Maine originally. And then I did my undergrad in Massachusetts, and then I went up to Alaska for my master's, and then I was in Colorado, and then I was in Australia. And anyway, I've been all over the place. Until I interviewed for this position, I had only been in New York once. And I've only lived here about a year and like 3/4. So I haven't actually made it up to the Adirondacks yet. It's on my to-do list. Finding bogs up there would be glorious.
Well, those
So-
are too big.
Yeah, so that'll go on I really want to do it. That'll be my New York bucket list, is to go and find myself some nice Adirondack peatlands.
Good time to go to Montezuma.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's a good place too.
Far,
It's a great time of year to go to Montezuma.
before the bugs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, that is the, like, we're pretending the mosquitoes. So like in my field site in Alaska, we would assess mosquito density. We'd have our field notebooks and then we'd like leave it out and we'd measure the density of how many mosquitoes we killed so we could compare it.
Yeah.
We wear bug nets. We would have to eat our lunch like this under a bug net.
Well, that's, you need to learn.
Yeah.
But they're black.
Yes, and black flies and deer flies and horse flies and all the fun, nasty, bitey friends.
My friend from Alaska thinks that the bugs.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll report back.
We have a pretty active hiking club here, and they go to the Adirondacks all the time. I mean, there are people that really know where stuff is, so that's a resource. Triple Cities Hiking Club, and Larry Bloomberg and Scott Locker, who are online today, are very, very active in that. So you've got lots of resources as to where stuff is.
Yeah, and Waterman Conservation Center is a good place to check out too. They've got 6 nature preserves that they take care of them. And I'm sure they're aware of a lot of other places that might be interesting to go check out too. And the Naturalist Club too. Locally, they're aware of a lot of things too. Anybody else online got any questions or?
No more questions, we just have, but thank you, well done presentation, and someone else said this was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Amy. Appreciate it.